Hey everybody, Kit Merker here from Noble 9, and I'm talking to Niall Murphy, who's the SRE lead for Azure at Microsoft. Say hi, Niall.
Hi,
Nice to have you here.
nice to be here.
Well, we were chatting a little bit before we turned things on, and I think there's an interesting question I'd really like to pose to you as an ex-Google guy who's now at Microsoft and spreading SRE. There are a lot of companies I talk to out there who are saying, I'm not Microsoft, I'm not Google. Do I really need SRE? And they're kind of almost using that as a rationale for not focusing on reliability, or at least not the way that the larger kind of internet scale companies work. What do you say to people who are kind of in that position?
So on a day-to-day basis, I see the opposite. I see lots of people coming to me asking about SRE. Interestingly enough, I see them asking Microsoft or feeling that Microsoft's approach and solutions in this area probably map more to their particular situation, particularly if they're an enterprise company, rather than Google, which is seen, I believe, correctly as somewhat of an outlier, even within the overall context of Valley companies and Valley engineering culture. For folks who are saying, I don't think we really need to investigate this SRE or this DevOps thing, like we're fine how we are, my intuition is that the average state of the relationship, certainly between development and operations, is quite poor, particularly if you haven't paid attention to it, and probably particularly if you are saying we don't need to pay any attention to it. Like you're probably missing something. But
Right, right. And we had, so on the kind of misconceptions of SRE, we were chatting a little bit on Twitter at some point, and kind of talking about, well, maybe there's a misconception that SRE means carrying the pager. And what do you think caused that misconception, and how would you change that perception?
yeah, there's a lot that could be said there. I'm obviously somewhat personally to blame for some of the popularization of the term SRE in some respect. I think, quite honestly, a lot of the difficulties that arise when questions of identity about SRE come up, particularly in the enterprise context, is that you can look at SRE as, forgive my language for the moment, but you can look at SRE as I'm an operations person growing up into development, or I'm a development person growing down into operations. Like, I don't like that language myself, but it's how a lot of people, particularly senior decision makers, model the situation in their head, and it's how a lot of departments have historically been constructed. So when people are saying, "Oh, an SRE is a person who carries a pager," to my mind, not necessarily. You have to have some kind of operational exposure because you're dealing with the act and the art of productionizing things and making sure that the product runs well in production. And there's all kinds of nuance to that, right? But I think that in some sense we have a default incorrect approach of saying, okay, the operational component and the incident management component of what you're doing is the most important thing. We collapse all of this capability to the single pager, and all of the rest of it disappears. Whereas, in fact, what actually matters is the ability to influence the whole SDLC from design all the way through to deployment, et cetera, et cetera.
This is a very interesting point, and so when you think about taking kind of a step back and looking at the whole SDLC, the whole software development lifecycle, what does it take to create proactively reliable software, right? This sort of productionization, because one way to look at this is, well, if I do continuous improvement and I have incidents and I respond to those and I have postmortems, maybe I can kind of incrementally react my way to proactive software. But is that enough, or is that just sort of necessary but not sufficient?
Yeah, that is a fascinating question. I think the way I model it at the moment is that with a static environment, if all you did was process postmortems and process them perfectly, by the way, which is no mean feat, but if you had a static environment and you processed postmortems and incidents perfectly, you would asymptotically approach uh, higher levels of reliability because, statistically speaking, as you came across more and more rare outages or corner cases, etc., you would over time refine them. But like that theoretical position is essentially completely useless because no environment is static. At the very least, for successful businesses, at least you have some incremental growth. incremental growth drives all kinds of new architectures eventually. New architectures bring new ways of failing. In fact, your current architecture brings new ways of failing as well. So my intuition is from a reliability point of view, you definitely need attention to the full stack or the full array of possibilities offered by the SDLC. You need to be able to attack design. You need architectural level concerns in order to do that. You need to be able to attack corner cases in production. You need observability, all of that kind of stuff.
So it's almost like the postmortems. If I was to kind of look at it, it's almost like they're mid-mortems in a way because it's never really dead. And the reality is that the change in the system is introducing so many new novel cases that if all you did was sort of plug the holes of yesterday's crisis, you're never going to get there. That's kind of fair.
Well, I think with a sufficiently complicated system, you could make that argument in practice and it would end up being like essentially true. Whether or not all software systems even admit of a finite chasing down of a fixed set of bugs, like there's a huge question mark over that. And that's where I have a lot of sympathy with the folks in the resilience engineering end of things. Although famously I have some difficulties with it, but I'm definitely aligned with them on the statement that sufficiently complicated techno-social systems essentially have infinite detail in them. And so it doesn't really, it's not a tractable approach to just say, okay, what we'll do is we'll set up a group whose only function is to look at what pops out the end, and they've no ability to influence what goes on before, and they're kind of a wandering minstrel class. And that doesn't actually end up working out too well.
It's interesting. It's interesting. You know, it kind of makes me think again, going back to this sort of misconceptions and trying to achieve reliability or resiliency. One thing I hear a lot, and I'd love to hear your take on this. I hear a lot from SREs or operations DevOps folks that they need leadership buy-in for reliability, right? They need the support of management. But then I also talk to a lot of people in management and a lot of executives, and what I hear from them is I've given the team clear direction that they need to have it be 100% reliable. It needs to be perfect. It needs to be secure. Don't embarrass me in front of customers. Tell me what you need. So why are they both saying this? I have my own theories about this disconnect, that management thinks they're supporting reliability, but the reliability people don't think they're getting the support they need. Love to hear your explanation for why this phenomenon exists.
I guess we have a couple of hours. I think there are many factors going on here. I suppose the thing I would pick out of what you just immediately said, even though that's not necessarily what everyone in the decision-making community is saying.
Of course.
But the things I would pick out were, I told them it should be 100%. Well, first of all, that's probably the wrong number, as we know from our SLO theory. But even if it's not the wrong number, you said, I want it to be 100%, but you didn't say, comma, and here's the giant check I am writing to all of the vendors and so on and so forth in order to support this. There's a, I wish this to become true intentionality. That's good. But there isn't necessarily a follow-up of what exactly has to be supported to happen, you know, with money, reorgs, prioritization statements, incentive structures, et cetera, within the organization in order to make that happen. So it's more a kind of a fire and forget style declarative approach, which generally doesn't work too well.
So you brought up the SLOs in that context, service level objectives, and maybe you can say a little bit more about how service level objectives might help in that discussion between, or do they? I mean, do they help with the business side of it, or is it really just an engineering tool? How do you view SLOs in that context? And I know you contributed to the SLO book recently, so congratulations on that.
No worries. So again, we could have a rather extended discussion about SLOs, but in brief, the way I understand them is they're a way to encapsulate a relationship between what the business thinks about the product and what the user's experience of it is, and how engineering should conduct itself in order to make that happen. in so many conversations, I mean, it's hugely common. There is this disconnect between decision makers who don't really understand the space in engineering, but who might understand the user experience quite well or have a great product vision. And so the same levers you use in the product space aren't necessarily the same levers you use elsewhere, particularly in the engineering for reliability domain. So SLOs is really a way to impedance match between those two cultures, because on the one side, you're saying to the business, okay, you need to pick a number. I mean, in the simplest possible model, right? You need to pick a number, and this number is how uh, how reliable you want the overall system to be, and the level of customer experience that the users have. But that number is strongly connected with consequences for your engineering teams. And the consequences can be as simple and crude as, 10 times the reliability costs more than 10 times the cash, which is often the case at certain levels in the curve, right? But the consequences can also be as subtle as, well, it turns out that there's a relationship between the velocity you're going at in your engineering team, your deployment of features, how that affects production and so on, and the user experience. And you need to kind of back off when you're going too fast in order to stay between the safety lines of the product. And so SLOs is a way to figure out what those safety lines are commonly across a unified set of people, across engineering, business, product, etc., and have that be agreed. And even having it agreed is a huge positive step for many organizations, where if you're just operating in parallel with these kind of set of assumptions about how things work, it doesn't go very well, as I keep saying.
And assumptions you may not even be sharing with each other, right? And
Exactly.
there's a lot of power in being able to say, as the business stakeholder, say, look, 1 out of 1,000 people who hit the refresh button on our website, if it's an annoying page load and not the fastest page load time, that's okay. And you've basically just defined a latency SLO, right? A 3 nines latency SLO. So yeah. What maybe you can tell me, kind of shifting gears a little bit. You're later in your career, you're a senior guy. You got people coming up in tech right now, and maybe what are your thoughts for people who are kind of entering the industry? This is something I've been asking a lot of people just to kind of get perspective on this. We have no shortage of technology problems, no shortage of technology jobs. How do we make people feel welcome? What should they be doing? What should we be doing to help them enter the workforce? What should we be doing to encourage new voices in the next generation of tech? What are your thoughts on that area?
You do not ask the easy questions. This is good stuff. So
You're welcome.
you're welcome. I think there's a bit of a difference between what I would recommend in the COVID era, and it's not clear how long this era will last quite yet, and what we could say would be a post-COVID steady state. I think the answers are kind of slightly different, with obvious difficulties in the COVID era of how do you onboard a person when you never see them? You got to ship stuff to their house, and there are some people who, I mean, it's a small number of people, but there are some people who might not even have a house to ship to. And from a full diversity and inclusion point of view, the COVID era presents really a very large number of problems. But it's not as if we didn't have a lot of problems before COVID either, particularly with respect to all of the stuff we have in the industry, with people setting themselves up as gatekeepers for proclaiming who should appropriately be in the industry and who should not. I think that all of us in positions of leadership, it behooves us to get on stages and to publicly say, that isn't okay. We need to be actively saying it is okay for you to join the technical industry. I mean, that's one set of things. As Liz Fong Jones says, the pipeline is leaky and full of acid. We can do whatever we can to funnel more people into the pipeline, but we have to also make the experience of being in the pipe more sustainable. I've spoken about this particularly at SRE Con 2017, if I recall correctly, about various things we can do in the industry to ranging on across all things like use of language to make it just a bit more inclusive, guys versus folks and so on, that kind of language. That could be viewed in some circumstances being a minor optimization. There are potentially major optimizations to do with pay equity, uh, HR, and the processing of serious allegations. The Susan Fowler document still blows my mind every time I read it, etc. Um, there are just so many things that seem so basic to me with respect to what a functioning organization and equity of treatment means. Those are fundamentals to be tackled almost before we do anything else. But we need action across a wide variety of
Yeah.
actions, I
Yeah.
suppose.
You covered a lot of I agree with you on all of that. And when I think about the COVID era that we're in now, I think it presents an opportunity in some ways because I agree with you on the challenges side of it. But the opportunity is also to level the playing field in terms of we can get on the phone here, have a video conversation, and neither of us got on a plane or anything else. And social media is connecting us. We've never met in person, and I DM'd you on Twitter after we interacted, talking about something we're both passionate about. And how can we use, I think, this era we're in now as an opportunity to be inclusive? I think is the question I'm also kind of interested in, in terms of mentoring or sharing experiences or learning from people that are different than us. What are your thoughts on kind of that space?
Yeah, so I think the great benefit, as you say, of the COVID era is that a bunch, in particular, I'll localize this for decision makers, but I actually mean it for more or less everyone, right? But a bunch of decision makers who were maybe scared or more conservative about making decisions about widespread decentralization, working remotely, etc. My ex-employer was famously bad at supporting remote work, viewing in a very strong kind of valley culture way that all of the people had to be together, ideally in an open office, in order to have maximum kind of throughput on the team.
Even to the point of defragging.
Indeed. Now, it turns out that like 4 months into this thing, most of the stuff has kind of kept going mostly as it was previously. So a bunch of decision makers are now going, oh, well, actually, maybe we don't need to have everyone in the Bay Area, or maybe we don't need to have everyone in Office X or whatever. I think some companies, particularly the younger ones, of course, who are fully remote, I wouldn't say they have all of this worked out. They have all of the same problems that all of the other companies do, but they possibly have less inertia to changing it or reacting rapidly or so on and so forth. So my sense is, as in most challenges of adaptation, the smaller and more agile things will do better initially, but the larger ones have kind of more weight to put behind any particularly strong initiative. The other thing I would say about the COVID era, it has been termed a kind of a great leveler or a great leveling effect. I think that's both true and false. I think it's true in the sense that when everyone is on the call, as opposed to there's 7 people in the room and 2 people on the call, and often the dynamics of that situation lead to the 2 people on the call being ignored or kind of talked over or so on. I've been a remote participant in many, many, many meetings, and that's a very common effect. And that happens less in a fully remote scenario, possibly even much less. But the thing I can see happening, which I haven't seen happening yet, but I can see it happening, is as restrictions get loosened and it becomes acceptable for people to gather again in an office, we'll see the same effect come back, except that the transatlantic travel, which we previously used to kind of glue together stuff, I think that'll be possibly unavailable for longer than the previous time scale. So I think there's a lot of subtleties waiting to be dug out there. But in terms of opportunities, yes, a more egalitarian kind of approach for calls is good. You would think this is the perfect time to write down all of the stuff that's been in your head that you haven't wrote down. You just said it to your colleague when they asked you like a couple of months ago. I find some organizations are investing in that and some of them aren't. And some of them are trying to scale by having all of the same one-to-ones that they previously did, except just over VC rather than a quick 5 minute in a meeting room somewhere. Um, I'm not sure I've seen anyone have a perfectly planned out response to this, but that's because there isn't one. Uh,
Yeah.
anyway.
So tell me this, again on opportunity and kind of the change, the shift that we're in right now, reliability. As a general feature, if you will, or a capability of organizations. More important, less important? What's the future of reliability, broadly speaking, for organizations that now are kind of thrust into what I'll use the buzzword digital transformation overnight, right? Their 5-year digital transformation plan just got compressed down. How does reliability play into that? What's your advice to organizations that are kind of grappling with this new reality?
Yeah, I think Satya might have said recently that it's something like 3 years worth of digital transformation in 3 months, or no similar numbers. I think my sense is there are things which have happened substantially more easily than companies thought they would. So this migration to almost completely or total in many cases VC for meetings rather than in-person meetings, etc. A lot of the dynamics of those have essentially seamlessly moved online. And so many things where there's a one-to-one mapping between a behavior you had beforehand and a slightly different behavior you have to have now, that's okay. Like that's relatively easy. For things where you have to have an entirely different behavior, like onboarding, there's a diversity of models that have sprung up, and some people are, or some organizations try to be more organized than others. But the beginning of your question was really about reliability and what that means in the era of COVID. Again, my sense is this is a strongly sectoral variation. I think that, for example, pubs or clubs or restaurants that used to have piped music, like if you're not open, you don't really care how reliable the music is, so that's possibly less important. But VC companies, by which I
This
mean
example may be a window into your personality, by the way.
video conferencing, and there was, I'm not sure how public we've been about it, but we did a lot of work in Teams in order to keep Teams up and running and scaling in order to accommodate the fact that the world essentially over a 2 to 3 week period said, okay, we're going to use your product now. It's the same, I suppose, for the Hangouts and the Zooms and the so on. My sense is reliability is even more important than it was. If you thought that people beforehand were like, I really want my online system to work and I'm not super patient and I want to order this thing or I want to stream this movie or whatever, now it has an additional character of, if I don't have this ability, I'm actually kind of hosed. So reliability is even more important. Having said that, again, it's not necessarily sectoral, but there's probably a business variability about whether or not there's a substitutable behavior or a substitutable product. Like, for example, if your Zoom isn't working, you might be able to Teams, or if your Gmail isn't working, you might be able to Outlook or whatever. All of those switches were available to you beforehand, but you had less impetus to do that. Whereas now, if one of them isn't working, you actually can't get up from your seat, go up 2 flights of stairs, knock on
Yeah,
the
the risk, the consequences, and the risks of unreliability have gone up. I think is kind of the point, right? That's what you're getting at.
Yeah, and a 3 nines pre-COVID and a 3 nines post-COVID for Teams are very different numbers, right? So
Thanks again, and maybe we'll talk again in the future. What do you think?
No worries at all. Anytime.
All right, everybody. This is Kid here, signing off.